All right, so good afternoon, everybody. So welcome to our last session of the Forage Forum Fridays for this group. We are planning on having another, I think, 5 to 6 week session this fall. So I have everybody's email, so you'll get notified when we get ready to start that group up to have some more in-depth forage discussions. So we hope the last 6 weeks have been educational, that you picked up a little bit from it. And probably early next week, watch your emails because there will be a short evaluation coming out. So if you could fill that out, we'd greatly appreciate it. So today, you get me as a speaker again. So again, I'm Elysia Rodgers. I'm the Ag and Natural Resource Educator with Purdue Extension up here in DeKalb County, which is almost the very northeast county of the state. But today I'm going to be talking about kind of types of rotational grazing. So last week we talked about grazing, kind of the continuous, rotational, and managed intensive grazing types. And today we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about different types of rotational grazing, talk a little bit briefly about watering, and then we'll also be talking about different resources and organizations that can be beneficial to us as forage producers. So go ahead and get started. All right, so so our objectives for today are going to be looking at the different types of rotational grazing systems, and then also looking at resources and organizations for us as forage producers. And if any point along the way you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or we'll kind of stop at different points and you can ask them then. So like we talked about last week, like Miranda introduced, we'll start with just kind of the broad concept of rotational grazing. So rotational grazing is basically taking a large pasture and just dividing it up into smaller paddocks is basically what we're doing. And then grazing these paddocks in kind of a planned sequence. And what that does is it really helps to kind of give our plants a break, a chance to regrow, like we talked about last week, to be able to get their solar panels back out and start photosynthesizing, so they can start gathering that sun, storing their resources again into their roots, and get to really growing and producing like they should. So again, like we said, periods of rest for plants while others are being grazed. So it's not like a continuous grazing system where animals can come in and graze their favorite plants overly heavy, creating kind of an overgraze situation like we talked about last week. We want to try to prevent. And instead, this provides a break for those plants and kind of shortens up the area where those animals are actually eating. So it kind of forces them to eat more of what's there than just kind of wandering all over, kind of picking and choosing. So there are a lot of great benefits to it. I see I've got a couple that have been repeated twice, but so we get increased forage production. So again, we get the animals to focus on grazing in kind of those more limited areas, which can help increase kind of what's eaten down, not make any areas kind of overly mature, which could do drop seed production, but also cause our forages to lose their nutrition. It can increase our animal performance because again, when they're grazing optimally in rotational grazing, they should be grazing the plants when they're most nutritious. So they have really good leaf growth on them. We don't really see a lot of seed heads yet, so that those leaves are really concentrated with their nutrients. Once we get into the seed production on those plants, we really start to lose that nutritional value really quickly. It allows our plants to remain healthy by renewing their energy reserves. Like we talked about last week, they need to get their photosynthesizing solar panels out. So especially on our legumes, you get those leaves back out and they can collect that energy and start storing their reserves again. We're rebuilding our plant vigor, so making sure that it's not getting overly grazed, giving it time to rest and get back up to where it needs to be. We can have long-term maximum production. So by rotationally grazing, it should help our stands last a little bit longer than what they might be in a continuous grazing situation or even a heavy hay production situation. And then our manure nutrients are more evenly distributed. So I've got a nice picture somewhere where it shows that our animals are basically our own manure spreaders. So when they're walking around kind of in a more confined area, but rotationally moving, they spread that manure more evenly than if they were in a continuous lot where it's just wide open and they can graze where they want to. A lot of times they may find a favorite corner to do their business in. And so that may result in a collected area heavily with manure, urine, things like that, versus a rotational grazing where it forces them to move about and spread their manure that way. So this is an example, just a picture showing a rough rotational grazing. We can see here where we start with one paddock, we move to the next, we move to the next, and we move to the next. So a lot of times with rotational grazing, it depends on kind of the weight of the animal, how much forage we have out there. So going into the nuts and bolts of this can definitely be like another 4-hour topic on itself. But basically you're looking at how much forage is out there, how high it is, how dense it is. And there are great calculations in our forage field guide to be able to figure that out. And once you know how much forage is out there, you'll get an idea based on how many animals you have and how many animal units that equates to how long you should leave them in that section of pasture, whether it's going to be a day or if you have enough to leave them out there for 3 or 4 days. That's how this rotation goes. So. Next type we'll talk about real quick is strip grazing. So pretty simple, sounds just like it is. So we're using a movable electric fence to allow enough forage for a short time period, and then moving your fence forward to the next new fresh grass or fresh forages. Usually in this method, we aren't doing any back fencing. So this allows the animal to go back, especially if you have just one water source in that paddock. It allows those animals to go back and get water if they need to. And you don't necessarily have to move the water each time you move those animals. Also helps kind of reduce trampling a little bit so they aren't kind of in one section only. They can still move about, especially as they get more and more strips available to them. A lot of times this is done using for stockpiled forages. So in our winter situations, this is where we can definitely use them. If you've ever heard of the term bale grazing. So you set out round bales strategically early in the winter before it gets too snowy or cold, and kind of fence those areas off. And then throughout the winter, you kind of fence or release the fences around those round bales and kind of move them forward, but provide them that area to go back to if need be. Basically, it can help increase our utilization and decrease animal selectivity. So again, the same idea with the rotational grazing. It's a type of rotational grazing. We're just kind of forcing them to go to the new area where they can graze that nice new grass, but go back if they want to get water or if there's shade there, things like that. So a really good example of strip grazing practices would be for dairies. So a dairy might in the morning go out, collect the cows, go milk them, let them back out, and introduce them to or release the fence for a new section of the pasture. Mid-afternoon, if they come back out for milking again, they'll go back in the barn, they'll get milked, they'll come back out, and they'll let the next section of pasture go. So that's a lot of times maybe what dairy farms will do, because that way they can work on maybe field by day or a couple of days. So they don't have to always go back in and back fence, because if you're letting the cows out into the same pasture, it would be hard to back fence. Then you'd have to let them through this fence to get to the new one each time you're taking them back to the barn to milk, if that makes sense. So this is an example of a field that is strip grazing. So we can see here we have our lines where each new pasture or paddock would be moved forward, but then we would not come in and put this fence back up. So maybe by the end of the day, all 3 of these fences would be down. They'd have this whole paddock area, maybe overnight to finish up and get moved to the next paddock area the next day. So this could be a little bit more like a managed intensive grazing system. This would be where you're out there with the animals a little more often. So that way they have kind of a more controlled area than maybe just a regular rotational grazing area. Another idea on rotational grazing is going to be something like creep grazing. So it's just like if you have a creep feeder full of mineral and supplement, things like that for our younger animals. This is an instance where we can give our younger animals access to a higher quality pasture or forages through a creep gate. So yes, so Leanne, going back to the last strip grazing, yes, the livestock would have access to the whole pasture, but basically we'd have the whole pasture to start with. Let me go back to the picture real quick. So we'd have this whole pasture to start with. So in the morning, the setup might look like this, where you'd have 4 smaller sections in that paddock for the day. So in the morning, you could go out and if this is where they stayed overnight, potentially, you can release this fence, let them graze this until maybe midday, come back in, release this fence, maybe until evening chore time, and then release this final fence for overnight stay or something along those lines. It may be where you're going out there every 6 hours and letting them have another block to graze. And then once they're done with this paddock, you would move on to your next one that you have set up. So yeah, sorry, that got a little confusing. My brain's in a little fog this morning. So going back to the creep grazing, again, letting our younger animals graze that higher nutritional forage to start with. So we basically have a fence set up with some sort of gate where those animals can get out, but not the adult animals. So they can basically graze ahead of where our older animals are going to be coming behind. So this could be, like we said, for calves. It could be for lambs, for sheep. Basically, they're getting that chance to eat that better feed before the adults come back in behind them. Granted, it may only be a day or 2 difference, but a day or 2 can make that much difference in our nutrition. So really, it's only just a small little lead ahead of time. So it may be a quarter of that next paddock size, but just enough to give those, I'm gonna say kids, give those babies a chance to get some better nutrition. So something kind of like this we see here. So we have our older, more mature animals, moms, maybe some feeder steers, wean steers, and then we have our younger stock over here on the left with our creep gate in between. Now, if you're doing a really true rotational grazing system and have movable fence, this may be a little more difficult because most of the movable fence that I have seen will be like a single strand, or you could use the polynet wire, especially from Premier One is one that's really popular. So trying to create a creep gate in that fence line, to me, seems a little bit more difficult than if you had more of a permanent type of fence with an actual gate in it for those animals to move. So this might be one that you could play around with a little bit, but maybe a little more difficult to achieve in a true creep feeder fashion. And we'll talk about a little bit different method that may be easier coming up next. So this method is called the forward grazing or leader follower grazing type. And for me, this might be a little bit easier to manage on a rotational basis than a creep. Yes, so the creep gate would be a lot narrower or have a lower entrance for those younger animals. A lot of times if you've seen creep feeders, they have you've got kind of the feeder housing up here. It's kind of got an overhang so it protects the feed. And then like a little pen with kind of a gate area that may only be 8, 12, 14 inches wide that those smaller animals should be able to get through, but the larger moms won't be able to. So those babies can go in, get the extra feed that they need, and then go back out and join their moms again. So that's what I'm saying. Trying to incorporate a gate of some sort into a rotational grazing would be a little more difficult. Yep. So Susanna had a great point here. So one way to do the creep system with cows and young calves, you can just raise the wire a little bit. So calves can get under, but the cows are more restricted. Granted, some calves, once they get a little bit bigger, may still try to get under the fence and may learn that the fence hopefully is still hot. But yeah, that would be one way you can definitely graze the younger calves, especially. It's just kind of have one of your, or a couple of your, poles for the ground raised up just a little bit higher. I mean, 4 inches doesn't seem like a lot, but for a calf, that could be just enough that they may need. So, yep, thank you, Susanna. So the forward grazing or leader follower grazing is this next type. So this is where we have 2 groups of livestock utilizing the same paddock, and one follows right after the other or fairly closely after the first group. So it lets those that need that higher nutrition graze first, and then the ones that need the lower nutrition come back in. Or this can be done with 2 different species. So an example would be with my parents' farm. They do both sheep and cattle. So a lot of times they'll come in, graze, I think which one that goes through first. A lot of times depends on what paddock they're in. So sometimes the sheep will go first. They may eat different forages than what the cattle will eat or prefer. So the sheep will come in for a day or so, they'll move on, then they'll may give it a 2 or 3 day rest and bring the cattle in after them. And then they just kind of follow each other around the pasture. I've seen a lot of people also utilize poultry behind cattle, especially in pastures. Now the poultry aren't going to be moved maybe quite as frequently as what the cattle might be, but they like to come in and kind of scratch up that manure, kind of move about, help to break up some of those parasite cycles as well. So it's definitely, the leader follower grazing is definitely more of an example that you could do utilizing smaller and larger animals together. So we can see here, we have our smaller animals starting the lead, and then our older, more mature. So it could be where even you have 2 groups of cattle. So you have some that may have just been weaned that are coming out that you still want to get good daily gains on. So they may be leading the pack, you could say, coming out and getting the most nutritious. And then you can move them after a day. And then these older, more mature animals, so maybe they're finishing cattle. So some that have been out on pasture for a little bit longer that don't need to gain quite as much could be coming in behind and kind of grazing down to the proper height. So the 3.5 to 4 inches, and then moving on. So they're still getting about the same nutrition, but it's just that younger stock is getting the choice of the candy first versus the older stock. And then we have our managed intensive grazing, like we mentioned last week, or what a lot of people may refer to as mob grazing. So this is a concept that Greg Judy out in Missouri has really kind of capitalized on. It's kind of become what he's known for out there. I got the chance here going on 3.5 years ago to visit his place, and it's amazing what he does. So you're grazing a much larger concentration of animals in a smaller area for a much smaller time frame. So stocking densities, you could get up to 100 to 500,000 pounds of animal per acre. So you're looking at a much, much more concentrated group, but you're allowing longer rest periods between when they come back because you have such smaller groups. Yes, you do have to move them more frequently, but you're allowing a little bit longer rest period before you come back. So it forces our animals to graze everything within that section because there is such a smaller concentration, they don't really get a chance to kind of pick and choose what they want. It also helps to trample some of those weeds potentially that might be coming up into the ground. It can help kind of flatten out some of our other forages as well. But that may be one of the downfalls to the mob grazing as well if it's not done correctly, is because you are more concentrated, it can cause some more, lost my word. Compaction, there we go, that's the word I needed. Some more compaction into the ground because you are having that much more body mass in a smaller area. You can also have, because of that excess trampling, could cause issues with the crowns, especially on our legumes, being able to redevelop and grow well. So our stand persistence may suffer a bit with a mob type grazing if it's not done properly. So it is much more labor intensive. I mean, out there, Greg Judy was moving his animals, I think every about 4 hours, I think. So that was about 8 times a day, potentially, that he was moving those animals. That's a lot of moving. That's a lot of fencing you'll have to put up, because you have to not only back fence, but you have to forward fence as well. So you have to be ready for like the next 2 or 3 moves, and then be ready to come back behind them and put that fence back in behind. So it's a lot more labor intensive, can work well kind of with those with lower nutritional values. So if you do happen to skip a couple of hours, it's not going to hurt them as much versus if you were to try to do this with dairy animals that require that higher nutrition, it might be a bit harder to achieve. So this is the example here, like we saw last week, of kind of our basic rotational grazing here on the left. So you can see our concentration of animals. I mean, they're kind of bunched up in there, but they have some room to move. Looks like you get about four moves in this paddock area versus our intensive rotational grazing here on the right. So here you can see where they definitely are more concentrated with our managed intensive. You can see there are probably about 16 moves that you're going to have to move in this same area. So you'll definitely have to have a lot more time, more energy to get out there and move them. So, all right. Thank you, Susanna. Yeah, so Susanna says, caution, the managed intensive and the mob aren't synonymous. There is a difference to them, so I apologize. Thank you, Susanna. So. The next thing to mention, just broadly, because everybody asks, well, how long do I need to have my animals out there? How long do I need to have them rest? A lot of it depends on the weather and your forage growth. That's it. There's no direct answer as to, well, it's 21 days after the last time you were in there, you need to go back in. That's not a guarantee. It depends on how well that forage is growing back and really what your weather is or what your weather is going to be. So just kind of a broad idea. Legumes, you need to give about 3 to 4 weeks during optimal growth time. So when we have good weather, good moisture, so when they should be growing well, you need to give them about 3 to 4 weeks of rest to recover, get their solar panels back out and start photosynthesizing, and recover and come back before you come back in. Now, cool season grasses could take anywhere from 2 weeks if it's under really great growing conditions, up to 7 or 8 weeks if you happen to be in a drought. If it has to be in the heat of the summer when they just aren't getting as much moisture, which means they can't really photosynthesize and move their nutrients around quite as much. So cool season grasses really depends greatly. If you have a mixture of grasses and legumes, that can be, you're kind of basing it off of your grass height. So the cool season grasses are really the limiting factor there. So, but typically if your grasses are growing well, your legumes should be growing well as well. So just depends on our cool season and legume mixes. When we're looking at our warm season grasses, so usually our annuals, could take anywhere from 5 to 6 weeks if it's cooler weather. So for me, cooler weather is going to be kind of anywhere from about 78 degrees or colder. Usually that's kind of my breaking point. If it starts getting over 75, 78 degrees, it starts to get warm for me. So cooler weather would be about that point. Could take them anywhere from 5 to 6 weeks to recover. If you're looking at the hot weather, so the period where these usual warm season grasses really love, again, we're looking at the 80s plus on that temperature. They could recover in 3 weeks if they have good moisture. Now, if we're in a drought situation or any other sort of stress, if there's been a frost or something like that, it could take these forages quite a bit longer to recover. So that's where you have to go out. You have to scout your pastures. You have to walk through them, look at how they're growing, and kind of work under there. So. All right, so then we also need to mention kind of how much water is needed. So water is important to all livestock. They may have great pasture out there, but without a good source of water that's consistent, it's going to be hard for them to, again, get that and keep that energy up and keep them moving throughout the day. So the Natural Resource Conservation Service recommends about 30 gallons of fresh water per 1,000 pounds of animal per day. That may not seem like a lot, but if you have 2 beef animals that are, let's say they're at 1,000 pounds, that's 60 gallons. That's over a 50-gallon drum a day that they're going to need. So do you have a source to provide all that water for your animals? So 1,300-pound cow would need 39 gallons a day. A 30-cow herd is going to need 1,200 gallons a day. Now, this is on average. Obviously, in the heat of the summer, that water intake is going to go up. It's going to go down kind of in the cold of the winter. So this would be average temperatures. So maybe that 60 to 70 degree range is where these numbers are based off of. You get warmer than that, and these average numbers a day are going to go up. So a cow herd is going to need about 36,000 gallons of water in a month. So basically a cow can drink 2 gallons of water in a minute for about 4 minutes time frame. So that's going to be 8 gallons in 4 minutes that they can take down. And that's going to be about 3 to 5 times a day that they'll be doing that. So you have to look at, if you have a portable water source, is your underground line big enough to get that water in to refresh that tank fast enough to get all those animals the water that they need? So kind of a rule of thumb when you're setting out water sources for cattle is you want to have it within 800 feet of them at all times. At that point, they feel more comfortable coming up to the water tank 1 or 2 at a time, instead of, if it's farther than that, if it's 1,000, 1,500 feet away, you're going to have more of that herd mentality going to water at the same time. Is your tank large enough to hold all that water for all those animals? So let's say you have 10 cattle or 10 head of cattle that are coming up to drink water. So that's, let's see. That's going to be an 80-gallon tank at one time. Do you have a tank large enough to hold that and then to refresh by the time they come back up an hour or so later to drink again? So that way that last animal that may have to fight to get in there, are they going to have enough water left for that animal to really get a good drink? When we're looking at small ruminants, again, same rule of thumb, 30 gallons per 1,000 pounds of animal. So sheep and goats, we're looking at 150-pound goat is going to have 4.5 gallons per day. May not seem like a lot, but if you have a herd of 100 goats, you're looking at 450 gallons of water a day for those animals, or over 13,500 gallons per month. Do you have enough water in your well to keep them going? Do you have enough, like we said, are your pipes big enough underground to carry the amount of water needed? Are you just planning on having one kind of main water source in the pasture and having them walk back and forth each time you move, which is going to be a little more difficult to maintain if you're trying to do a rotational grazing? So on sheep and goats, the recommendation is to keep that water 300 feet from them. 300, 600. Might be 600. 600 feet from them. So not quite as large of a range as cattle, but you still need to pay attention to that. So if the water is farther than that, they're going to go together to that water trough, get as much water as they can before they travel back out. So kind of looked at a few different types of grazing today. So if you have any questions over those, we can go back over them. We can definitely, we've got a few of our NRCS specialists on. So if you have questions about watering systems and such, we can take a couple of minutes there. Again, setting up your actual pasture for rotational grazing, talking about fencing, talking about the specifics of watering, things like that. You can spend a day talking about that. And actually, I'll mention here in a few minutes about a grazing school coming up where we'll go more into detail on those things. But so, do we have any questions right now about anything that was just covered? All right. So we're going to take a few minutes now to kind of look at different types of resources that are out there for us as forage producers and livestock producers potentially, and the different organizations, at least here in Indiana, that are available. Most states have similar organizations to what we're talking about. So I definitely encourage you to look into them if it's something that seems interesting to you. The first is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS is what it's called. So NRCS provides farmers and ranchers and forest managers free technical assistance or advice for their land, and they are a division of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So technical assistance can be resource assessment, kind of practice design, resource monitoring, things like that. And that's through their Conservation Technical Assistance Program, or CTA. So it kind of provides landowners with knowledge and tools to conserve and maintain and restore the natural environment on their lands. The programs that NRCS is probably most known for, that you'll probably be most familiar with, is some of their financial assistance programs. So things like the EQIP grants. So that's the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. So this provides financial and technical assistance to producers to address our natural resource concerns and deliver benefits such as improved water. So they could help design different waterways. If you have a creek running through your property and you need to get from one pasture to another, they can help with some waterway developments there. Air quality, ground and surface water conservation, and definitely soil erosion and improvement. So EQIP is a great program to kind of look into. The other program is the Conservation Stewardship Program. So that helps producers improve existing conservation systems and adopt additional ones after different priorities of concerns have been addressed. So kind of payment for that kind of depends on your performance. So the higher the performance, the higher the goals achieved, the more payments are received. And then lastly is the Agricultural Management Assistant Programs, or AMAs. And these help producers manage risk and solve natural resource issues. And those are kind of, managed through risk and things like that. So, and if I misspoke, if anybody hears from the agencies, feel free to speak up if there's anything else need to add in today. Next group will be the Farm Service Agency, or FSA. And a lot of times the FSA and NRCS offices are going to be very close to each other in most of our buildings. So this again is another agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And again, serves our farmers, ranchers, and ag partners through efficient, effective ag programs. So these guys are the ones that help administer our farm commodity and disaster programs. So like probably one of the common ones will be the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP programs. So where producers are paid to keep some of their ground in kind of a more natural state to help conserve some of our resources, our natural lands, things like that. So provides credit to producers who are unable to receive private commercial credit, including emphasis on some of our beginner farmers, minority women farmers and ranchers, and helps deliver commodities for use in international humanitarian food programs. So probably the biggest thing from FSA in the last year are the CFAP payments, if you've heard about those. So that was the Coronavirus Food Assistance Programs. And that was a series of 2 or 3 payments, at least 2 payments so far, that was enacted last year to help livestock producers especially, and some row crop producers with just some of the offsets of the coronavirus and things like that. And that pertained to producers of all sizes. So even though my husband and I only have 6 acres, we do raise livestock, and we were able to get some payments last year. So that was really beneficial for us to work with our Farm Service Agency office. So next one is the National Agriculture Statistics Service, or NASS, or NASS, as it will oftentimes be referred to as. And this is kind of the statistical arm of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So these guys, you'll see a lot of different surveys coming out for them, things like that, collecting data. It may seem like it's a lot of questions, a lot of information, but it's a lot of good information that's collected. That data is used all over to help with resources, to help with funding from some of our other agencies and things like that. So everybody gets the same data, the same information at the same time. So it's not like some groups are privy to the information ahead of time. Everybody gets the same information from the same agency released at the same time. So this agency doesn't go out and kind of analyze that data. They're just a collection point. So they just kind of gather it together, and that's where our university economists, some other economists out there in the private sector, they do a great job a lot of times of collecting that data and kind of telling us what it really means for our ag outlook. So it helps our farmers, businesses, bankers to make better decisions. Some of the information is really interesting. So every year they come out with kind of statewide ag outlooks. So kind of what the production looked like the last year. So for me, it's always fun to kind of go in and see what, based on a statewide and a countywide basis, some of our crops did, how some of our crops did, what our livestock production looked like, even what happened in my county. So it's kind of a really interesting statistical service for us. So there are a lot of other ways that the data users can use that data. So for example, these were a few charts that were put together for me by Nathaniel Warinsky. He's our Indiana NASS individual. So this is an example of a chart that some people put together. So we can see here for Indiana, the hay acres and yields from 2001 to 2020. So 2001 is here on the right side. And then as you move left, the years increase. But it's really interesting to see where we were in 2001 in terms of the amount of hay ground over here on the right versus where we are now in 2020. I mean, that's the gold is, or the kind of black is kind of the harvested acres. So we were at 610,000 acres of hay here in Indiana. We're at 500,000 now, 20 years later. That's huge. That's a huge decrease. So it's interesting to see these figures. Here in the hay production versus the price of hay, again, we're kind of going from left to right in this case. But you can see here, dollars per ton over here in the black versus how much was produced. And then over here in 2020, it's almost flipped. So we have more production, but less average price. So it's really interesting to see where we are at. And then just a brief introduction to kind of our cattle and sheep inventory. Again, 2002 is here on our right. 2021 is here on the left. So cattle is in black. So we've stayed fairly close. I mean, 880,000 in 2002. We've got about 850,000 here. So we're within 30,000 head of where we were 20 years ago. Sheep, on the other hand, kind of took a massive dip for about 10 years, 10, 12 years, but now have had a drastic incline back to over 900,000 head in the state of Indiana. So it's really interesting to see what the different markets have looked like based on the history. So we have our soil and water conservation districts. So here in Indiana, we have a conservation district in every county. So they're here to help with our natural resource concerns on a local level. We do have the Indiana Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. So they work at the state level to help promote and enhance conservation. So they do work kind of at the legislative level. They help a lot with public outreach. So if you've been to the Indiana State Fair, we've got the section there that's sponsored by the Indiana Soil and Water Conservation Districts. And so they're really there to help provide information, conservation resources, potentially leadership opportunities, and maybe some of that funding on the local level to help with more local projects. So for my local SWCD here in DeKalb County, they have some cost share programs to help with things like cover crops, to help with some native tree plantings. We've got one that helps with some septic issues. So there are a lot of good information to look at with your local soil and water conservation district. Getting into some more of kind of our breed and species organizations. First one here in Indiana would be the Indiana Beef Cattle Association, or IBCA. And they've been together since 1975 and basically working together as Hoosier beef producers, men, women, everybody, to kind of get together to kind of advance their values, work with priorities with legislators and regulators, and provide education to everybody, not just their members, but others. They also help run one of our largest cattle shows here in Indiana, the Hoosier Beef Congress, throughout the year, and also have a great food stand at the Indiana State Fair selling ribeyes and other delicious meals. They also manage the Indiana Beef Checkoff Program. So this is supposed to be $1 per head of cattle that are sold in Indiana, and this helps with different programs that go on, such as beef and veal promotion, research, and other information. So it's a great program and a great association to belong to. The next is what we call the Indiana Boar Goat Classic. Now the Indiana Boar Goat Classic is technically the name of the show, but it's also the volunteer organization that helps with boar goat and meat goat exhibitors, producers, and enthusiasts come together in Indiana. So it helps promote the growth of these breeds of goat, which are going to be different than our next group that we'll look at. So it really helps with our youth in the state. They hold several shows every year where you can collect points and kind of get different awards and prizes throughout the year. So it's a really great organization to be a part of as kind of an introduction to the American Boar Goat Association as well. Then we have our Indiana Dairy Goat Association. So there may not be as many dairy goat producers on here, like my husband and I, but it's a great organization as well, made up of the dairy goat producers in Indiana. So they have monthly meetings throughout the year, provide great articles, minutes, a membership directory for all those that are involved. They also host a dairy goat show each year and do a lot of great work and help at the Indiana State Fair as well. So it's another good group. And then we have our Indiana Sheep Association. So they're another nonprofit organization to support, promote, and provide educational resources for Indiana sheep industry and its consumers. So it could be you're a sheep breeder or a wool producer, a lamb producer, or you provide feed for sheep and goat or for sheep. Great opportunity to be a member there. So again, striving to address producers' concerns, keep everybody informed of not just local, but national sheep news, and just getting together as a great group of sheep people. So those are kind of our statewide species associations that may pertain to some of our people here. We also have the National Hay Association. So this is the national trade association for the hay industry here in the United States. So they work with the hay industry, federal agencies, and Congress to work with kind of some of those environmental benefits to kind of benefit everybody involved. Again, another nonprofit organization of just good hay producers, brokers, dealers, and consumers. So working not just here on the national level, but also helping if there are international things as well. So. And then again, back here to Indiana, we have the Indiana Forage Council. So this is one that many of us, a few of us on this call are a part of. So I am actually the current president for the Indiana Forage Council. So it's my little plug for you all to join. So we've been promoting forage production, management, utilization, and marketing since 1966. So really we're just a great group of forage enthusiasts, you could call us. So we're either part of education. So some of us are extension members, some of us are ag teachers. We have some from the industry, so seed producers. We've got some other equipment dealers, things like that are a part of our membership. We've got just good growers, livestock producers. So it's a great organization to be a part of. So we as the Indiana Forage Council strive to lead the forage industry in Indiana and provide opportunities for our members to share ideas, to help improve forage operations, connect our producers together. So it's a great networking opportunity involving youth, adults, industry members, everybody. So, and with that, this is where, hopefully it's thinking. We'll give it a moment. It's a Friday. So this is where we have coming up our Indiana Grazing School that we've mentioned a few times, but this will be June 4th and 5th. We'll be at our Southern Indiana Purdue Ag Center in Du Bois, excuse me. And then June 11th and 12th up in Cutler, Indiana. And this is going to be a more in-depth day-and-a-half event to help educate producers more about managing your grazing systems properly. So this is where we'll get into that paddock design, the fencing and watering, our nutrition disease, just the nuts and bolts of it. So if you're interested in this, I'll send out this flyer with a reminder probably early next week. And so the cost is $75 per individual or $50 for an additional member from your farm, but they will not receive additional publications. So it's a good time. A lot of great information shared, a lot of great networking. And this grazing school is funded in part with a sponsorship from Livestock Producer Grant from the Indiana State Department of Agriculture. And as a member of the Indiana Forage Council, you become a member of the American Forage and Grassland Council, or AFGC. And this is an international organization made up of 22 affiliate councils. So between states in the US and Canadian provinces, there are 22 other organizations across the US that make up AFGC, and there are over 2,500 members. So that's a huge connection of forage and grassland people across the US or North America, you could say. So they promote the profitable production and sustainable utilization of quality forage and grasslands and dedicated to advancing the use of forages. So great opportunity. And as a member, they have great annual meetings each year. And they also do a newsletter called the Progressive Forage Grower. Yep, there it is. So this is a great resource. Great articles, interesting to learn about forage production across the U.S. So it's a great opportunity to be a member, not just your local forage organization, but also the national. So. And then one of the best resources that you can find when getting either started in grazing or if you have questions are just your fellow producers. Lot of great knowledgeable, there we go, people out there across the U.S. that have been raising forages for a while. So this is a pasture walk that my parents had hosted at their place a few years ago. Ignore the nice Canada thistle here in the foreground. That's in the fence row. But you can see just a lot of great people talking about what they've done on this property, some ideas moving forward. So this is a pasture of some summer annuals that they had planted, some sorghum Sudan. So you can see it's much higher than the cornfield in the background there. But yeah, your fellow producers are a great resource to get connected to learn more about, to go out and see what they're doing, to see if there are things you could pick up on, or if they have questions that you could help with. So definitely get connected with those around you, those that are kind of sharing with your ideas. And that's where like the Indiana Forage Council or your local soil and water conservation district could be great connectors to those local producers. I know up here, several of our soil and water conservation districts hold grazing meetings throughout the year. So where we'll go out to farms, we'll look at what people are doing. We'll take walks across the farm just to see what's going on. So those are some great resources I wanted to make sure to mention in case you haven't ever come across them or you're more curious. So definitely a lot of great resources, a lot of great organizations out there for us as forage producers, as livestock producers to be able to utilize and connect into. So with that, I thank you guys so much for participating the last 7 weeks, either live or watching recordings or both. I greatly appreciate it and everything that you guys have done to help improve this program. And again, look for an evaluation coming out next week to help us make it even better. So like I said, hopefully we're coming back in mid-August with some more sessions for you, with some more education and information. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, anything else you'd like to put in for today. All right, well, if there's nothing else, I thank you guys for joining me again today on Friday, April 16th, and hope you all have a great weekend, and hopefully we'll see you all when we get the next informational sessions out to you. So we'll look forward to getting those together here in the next few months. So, all right, thank you everybody, and have a great day. Okay, so once cattle are acclimated to legumes, is there any danger of bloat after that? So there is always a concern of bloat when you're working with legumes, just because of the makeup of the rumen with those legumes, because of the concentration of the nutrients. So there is always a concern. I mean, there could be, you've got dew that can cause issues. So if you're out there grazing them on dew, in the mornings. So, I mean, it's not every day that we're going to have dew, but some of those mornings it's heavier than others. So that can cause issues. So, but I mean, once you get them used to legumes, there is less of a chance, but there is still that chance when you're grazing just straight clovers or straight alfalfa. That is a chance you're going to take when you are grazing those legumes. So should add on to that. So that's why it's always a good idea to kind of add, if you can, a little bit of grass or even some dry hay into the mix when you're grazing those legumes. Yep, mixing grasses and legumes is a great solution to that. So it adds just a little bit different fiber content and such. Okay, is there a place to go to find out about upcoming pasture walks? So check with your soil and water conservation district locally. I know, at least up here in northern Indiana, LaGrange County is doing quite a few of them. Down there, you may check also with your extension office to see if they know of any coming up. So those would be the two places I would go to first to ask about pasture walks. And if not, it may be where you could get something started in your county. So. All right, well, thank you everybody. Have a great weekend and I hope you've enjoyed the series.